The laughter hit her like a slap across the face. It rang out sharp and cruel through the crowded Abilene market, bouncing off the wooden stalls and canvas awnings, until it seemed to come from every direction at once. Hannah Delaney stood frozen at the fabric merchant's table, her fingers still resting on a bolt of calico she could barely afford. Her cheeks burning so hot she thought the August sun had nothing to do with it. "Look at her," Mabel Crow said again, loud enough that the 24 people browsing the Saturday market could hear every poisoned syllable. "Still pretending she belongs here, still shopping like she has money to spend." She turned to her companions, 3 women in pressed day dresses with their hair pinned just so, and let out another peal of laughter that made Hannah's stomach turn over. "Tell me, Hannah, how much does a woman like you actually earn washing other people's linens? Enough for calico, or are you still borrowing from the charity barrel?" The fabric merchant, old Gerald Phelps, kept his eyes carefully fixed on something fascinating on the ground. The women nearby who might have spoken up suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. That was the way of things in Abilene in the summer of 1873. Mabel Crow's husband owned the biggest cattle brokerage in 3 counties, and that made Mabel Crow untouchable. Hannah's throat tightened. She had exactly 2 choices. She could set the fabric down, walk away with her head low, and give Mabel exactly what she wanted. Or she could stand here and take more of it, which would give Mabel the same thing only with a longer show. She started to fold the calico back onto the bolt. That was when she heard it. A single pair of boots on the dry earth, unhurried, deliberate, coming closer through the crowd. And then a voice that was low and clear and absolutely certain of itself cut through the laughter like a blade through summer air. "This woman is my guest." The laughter died. Every head in the market turned. Hannah turned too, because she could not help it, because that voice demanded it the way a church bell demands attention on a quiet morning. He was standing at the edge of the gathering crowd with his hat pushed back on his head and his arms loose at his sides. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had seen more weather than a man his age ought to have seen and come through it looking like something carved rather than worn. Dark eyes that were taking in the scene with the kind of calm that was not actually calm at all, but something quieter and more dangerous underneath. He walked straight to Hannah's side and picked up the bolt of calico she had been folding away. "She will take 3 yards of this," he said to Gerald Phelps, and produced a coin from his vest pocket that made the old merchant's eyes go wide. Then he looked at Mabel Crow, and there was nothing in that look except perfect, absolute certainty. "Is there something else you needed to say?" Mabel Crow opened her mouth, closed it, looked around for support and found that the crowd was watching with an expression she was not accustomed to seeing directed at her. She closed her mouth a second time and turned away, and her 3 companions turned with her, and they were gone between 2 stalls like smoke disappearing into open air. Hannah stood very still. She had no idea who this man was. She was fairly certain she had never seen him before in her life. And she was absolutely certain that, in 24 years of living, no one had ever done for her what he had just done. She looked up at him and found him looking down at her, and there was something in his expression now that had not been there a moment ago. Something quieter and less certain, as if he had acted entirely on instinct and was now only beginning to work out what that instinct had cost him. "I apologize," he said. "That was presumptuous. I should have asked you first." Hannah stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "It was incredibly presumptuous." A pause. "Yes, and I am very grateful." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close. "Cade Merritt," he said, and held out his hand. "Hannah Delaney," she said, and took it. That was the beginning of everything. "But to understand it properly, you have to go back 3 weeks. To the morning Cade Merritt rode into Abilene for the first time in 7 years, and tried very hard to believe he was not coming back to fix what he had broken. Cade had left Abilene in the spring of 1866 with $30 in his pocket, a horse that was not entirely his, and the bone-deep certainty that there was nothing left for him in that town. He had been wrong about most things in his 20 years of life up to that point, but he had been particularly and spectacularly wrong about that. He had spent the next 7 years figuring it out. He had gone to Texas first, because everyone went to Texas. He had hired on with a cattle operation run by a man named Fordham out of San Antonio, and he had discovered that he was very good at the work. Not just adequate, not tolerable, but genuinely skilled in the way that certain men are skilled at things their hands were made for. He could read cattle the way some men read books. He could read weather and land, and the moods of animals and men with equal accuracy. By 1870, he was Fordham's trail boss, running herds north along the Kishom Trail to the railheads at Abilene and Wichita. And by 1872, he had saved enough money to stop working for Fordham and start working for himself. That was when the letter came. It arrived at a relay station north of San Antonio on a cold February morning, addressed in the shaky handwriting of a man who had clearly not written many letters in his life. It was from his uncle, Robert Merritt, who had a small cattle operation 20 miles outside Abilene, and it said in its roundabout and apologetic way that Robert was dying, and that Cade was the only family he had left, and that the property needed someone to take it over, or it would be sold for debts. Cade had sat with that letter for 6 weeks. He had read it so many times the paper went soft at the folds. And then, on a morning in late April of 1873, he had saddled his horse and pointed it north. He arrived in Abilene on a Tuesday. The town had changed considerably since he left. The cattle trade had transformed it from a rough collection of buildings around a rail depot into something that aspired to be a proper town, with a main street and storefronts and a hotel that had 2 stories. There was a newspaper. There was a church with a real steeple. There were women in the streets with children beside them, which had not been the case when Abilene was nothing but a waypoint for cowboys and cattle buyers. He had ridden through without stopping, because his uncle's place was 20 miles out and he was already past due. He had spent 2 weeks there, assessing the damage, talking to the doctor who came out from town, sitting at Robert's bedside in the evenings while his uncle slept the fitful sleep of someone whose body was working very hard at the final project it would ever complete. He had worked out in his head what needed to be done to save the property and what it would cost and where the money would come from, and he had come back into Abilene on a Saturday morning to begin the process. He had not expected the market. He had not expected any of it, frankly. He had planned to go to the hardware store and the feed merchant and the land office and be done with town by noon. Instead, he had found himself walking through a street market that had apparently become a Saturday tradition in his absence, and he had been threading his way through the stalls looking for the hardware merchant when he heard the laughter. He could not have explained afterward, if asked, exactly why he stopped. He heard mockery in markets all the time. The West in 1873 was not a kind place, particularly for those without money or standing or the right connections, and the market in Abilene was no different from any other. He had heard men mock other men. He had heard merchants mock customers. He had, on one occasion he was not proud of, heard himself say something cutting to a younger cowboy who had made a mistake on the trail, and he had regretted it for longer than the situation probably warranted. But something about this particular moment stopped him in his tracks. Maybe it was the brightness of the woman's embarrassment, the color in her cheeks that he could see from 15 feet away. Maybe it was the cruelty of the woman doing the mocking, which had nothing in it of heat or anger but was perfectly, deliberately cold. Maybe it was the way everyone nearby was looking carefully away, that particular variety of cowardice that Cade had always found more troubling than open hostility. He had walked forward before he made any decision to do so. The words had come out of his mouth with a certainty that surprised him because he did not know this woman and had never spoken to her, and had absolutely no grounds for calling her his guest in any technical sense. And yet, he had meant it completely. He gave Gerald Phelps the coin for the calico, and then stood next to Hannah Delaney while old Gerald cut the 3 yards and folded them, and the market gradually resumed its normal rhythms around them. And the whole time he was aware of her the way you are aware of something that has changed in a room you thought you knew. She was not what he would have called conventionally pretty, in the way that the word was used in 1873, which meant soft and pale and arranged carefully for display. She was something better than that. She was the kind of woman who looked like she had been built for actual use, with strong hands and a directness in her brown eyes that made you want to say something worth hearing when you opened your mouth. Her dark hair was pinned up neatly, but a few strands had come loose in the heat, and she had not bothered to fix them, which he found inexplicably charming. She wore a dress that had been mended at the hem twice, recently, and her boots were clean but old, and none of that diminished her in the slightest. Gerald handed her the folded calico. She tucked it under her arm and then looked at Cade with an expression he could not entirely read. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. Most people don't. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment, studying him with those direct brown eyes. "Why did you?" He considered several answers and discarded all of them because they were all either dishonest or incomplete, and he had a long-standing policy of not being either of those things if he could help it. "I am still working that out," he said finally, which was the truest thing he could offer. She seemed to accept that. She shifted the calico under her arm. "I should tell you that I am not actually your guest, and I have no idea who you are, and this entire interaction is highly irregular." "It is," he agreed. "And you should know that Mabel Crow is going to be very unpleasant about this for a very long time. I have dealt with unpleasant people before. Not like Mabel Crow, you haven't." But something in her expression softened slightly as she said it, as if the very certainty in his voice was doing something she had not given it permission to do. They stood in the middle of the Abilene Saturday market in August of 1873, and the cattle trade went on around them, and the merchants called their prices, and the horses stood at their hitching posts, and the sun hammered down on the dust of the street, and neither of them moved to leave. "Are you in town often?" he asked. "Every Saturday. I do laundry work for several families here." She said it plainly, without any of the defensive quality that people sometimes used when talking about how they earned their living, which he respected immediately. "And sometimes during the week if there is extra work. I am in town for the foreseeable future. My uncle has a place outside town and I am here to help settle his affairs." He paused. "I am staying at the hotel on Main Street, the Cattleman's." "That is the one." She nodded slowly. He had the impression she was making some internal calculation he was not privy to. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Merritt, for what you did. It meant more than you know." "Cade," he said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon, Cade. You can use my name." Another of those studying silences. Then, "Hannah," she said, just her name, like an offering. He tipped his hat. She turned and walked away through the market, and he watched her go. And then he stood there for probably 30 seconds longer than was necessary before he remembered. He had a hardware store to visit and land records to check, and approximately 40 other things that needed his attention. He forgot every single one of them for the next 2 hours. Hannah Delaney had come to Abilene 4 years earlier under circumstances that were, to put it gently, not what she had planned. She had come from Caldwell, Kansas, where she had been born in 1849 to a schoolteacher father and a practical, warm mother who had taught her to sew and cook, and also, somewhat unusually for the time, to read well and think clearly. Her father had died of fever in 1868 when Hannah was 19, and her mother had followed him 6 months later in the way that some married people did, as if the loss of one was enough to knock the other loose from the world. Hannah had been left with the house in Caldwell, which had a mortgage, and her father's books, which did not, and the understanding that she was alone and needed to work out what to do about it. She had done what young women in her position often did in those years. She had accepted a proposal from the first man who offered one. His name had been Thomas Wyatt, and he had been a land speculator from Abilene who had come through Caldwell on business, and met Hannah at a church social and written her letters for 3 months that were full of promise and warmth, and a future that sounded solid. She had sold the house, paid the mortgage, packed her mother's good china wrapped in her father's books, and traveled to Abilene in the spring of 1869 as Thomas Wyatt's fiancée. Thomas Wyatt had turned out to be less solid than his letters suggested. He was charming and handsome and fundamentally unreliable in the way that certain men are unreliable, not maliciously but constitutionally. The way a house built on uncertain ground will always eventually settle crooked. The land speculation had not gone well. There had been debts he had not mentioned. There had been a card game that took the last of their combined savings 6 weeks before their wedding date. And there had been, finally, a morning when Hannah woke to find a note on the kitchen table explaining that Thomas had gone to Denver because there was an opportunity there that was too good to ignore, and that he was sorry, and that he hoped she understood. She had not understood. But she had adapted, which was something different and in many ways more useful. She had stayed in Abilene because she had nowhere else to go and very little money to go there with. She had started taking in laundry, which was honest work that paid a small but reliable wage. She had found a room to rent in the house of a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who was near-sighted and good-natured, and charged her a fair rate. She had built, over 4 years, a quiet and careful life that was genuinely hers in a way that Thomas Wyatt's letters had never been. What she had not built, and what she had perhaps given up expecting to build, was anything like happiness in the larger sense. Stability, yes. Competence, yes. A small circle of genuine friends, including Mrs. Patterson and a young Mexican woman named Inez who worked at the hotel laundry. But the kind of life that included warmth and partnership, and being truly known by another person, that had begun to feel like a category that did not apply to her. Mabel Crow was a complication of a specific and ongoing sort. Mabel's husband, Francis Crow, had, several years before Hannah arrived in Abilene, been briefly involved with Thomas Wyatt in a land deal that had gone badly. And while Francis himself had largely forgotten about it, Mabel had not. She had transferred a general dislike of Thomas onto Hannah, with the precision of a woman who understands that you cannot punish the person who actually wronged you and so finds a substitute. Hannah had been dealing with Mabel's small cruelties for 4 years, and she had developed a kind of armor against them, a careful blankness that let the words slide off. Usually, today had not been a usual day. Today, the calico had been important because Mrs. Patterson's curtains were in genuine need of replacement, and Hannah had been saving for the fabric for 2 months. And the combination of something she had worked toward and something petty and public and unkind had been enough to get through the armor. And then Cade Merritt had spoken. She carried the calico back to Mrs. Patterson's house and sat at the kitchen table and turned the afternoon over in her mind while Mrs. Patterson made coffee and clucked sympathetically about Mabel Crow and did not ask any of the questions that were clearly pressing against the inside of her mouth with some urgency. Hannah was grateful for the restraint because she did not have answers. She did not know what to make of Cade Merritt, who was a stranger who had involved himself in her business and paid for her fabric and said his name like it was an invitation. She did not know what to make of the way her heart had done something uncooperative when he turned and walked toward her through the market crowd. That particular set of his shoulders, that absolute unhurried certainty in his step. She knew what she thought about men with charm. Thomas Wyatt had taught her that very thoroughly, but there had been nothing charming about Cade Merritt, not in the practiced, careful way that Thomas had been charming. There had been something else. Something blunt and direct and entirely without performance, as if he had simply done the thing that needed doing and was prepared to stand behind it without any expectation of reward. She drank her coffee and told herself firmly that she was being ridiculous. She had spoken to the man for perhaps 8 minutes. She did not know him at all. And she had excellent reasons, 4 years old and still fresh enough to ache on difficult days, for treating men who appeared suddenly with apparent goodness and said interesting things with a very great deal of caution. She made the curtains that afternoon. They turned out beautifully. On Monday morning, Cade rode out to his uncle's property early and spent the day doing the physical inventory of what remained and what needed replacing. Robert Merritt's operation had once been modest but functional. 20 years ago, when Robert had first built the house and the barn and fenced the pasture land, it had been the kind of small cattle ranch that a single determined man could operate with the occasional hired help. But Robert had been ill for the better part of 2 years, and illness and distance and time had done their work. And what Cade found was a property that needed serious investment before it could become functional again. He made his lists and did his calculations, and in the evenings sat with Robert in the low lamplight of the bedroom, and his uncle talked in the rambling way of sick people, jumping between decades and half-remembered conversations, and the names of people who had been gone for years. But there were also lucid stretches, sometimes an hour, sometimes more, when Robert was entirely himself. And in those stretches, the two of them talked about the property and what it needed and what Cade intended. Robert had opinions. They did not always align with Cade's, but they were expressed with the energy of a man who is putting his affairs in order and needs to know they will be cared for properly. "You need hands," Robert said on Monday evening. "2 good men at minimum, and the south fence has been down since spring." I am going to town tomorrow to talk to the land office and then start hiring. There is a man named Bill Tanner who worked for me 2 seasons ago. He is reliable and he knows the country. Ask at the feed merchant. He usually comes in on Tuesdays. Robert paused, his breathing careful. "And you will need to introduce yourself around properly. People remember you left." "I know they do. 7 years is a long time." "I know that too." Robert studied him with the clear eyes that illness had given him, that particular clarity that sometimes came at the end of things. "Is that why you stayed away so long?" "Because of what happened." Cade was quiet. Outside the window, the prairie dark was complete and absolute, and the only sound was the dry wind moving through the grass. "Partly," he said. He did not elaborate, and Robert did not press, which was one of the things he had always valued about his uncle. There were some subjects that were not ready to be spoken yet, and Robert had always had the wisdom to recognize them. The thing that had happened was this. In the spring of 1866, Cade Merritt had been 20 years old and working on his father's small property outside Abilene and in love, or what he had believed at the time was love, with a girl named Clara Ames. Clara was the daughter of the man who owned the feed store, and she was bright and pretty and laughed at things Cade said in a way that made him feel very large about himself. He had been planning to ask her to marry him. He had saved money for a ring. He had practiced the words. He had come to ask her on a Tuesday afternoon, and found her on the porch of her father's house with a young man from an established Abilene family, a man with prospects and a surname that meant something in the territory. And Clara had looked at Cade with an expression of genuine regret that was somehow worse than contempt, because it told him that she had known exactly what she was doing and had not thought it unkind enough to stop. He had left for Texas the following Monday. He had told himself he was going because of opportunity and because the West was full of it. Both of those things were true. But Robert's question on Monday evening found its target accurately, and Cade lay awake for a time afterward, staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom, thinking about the ways that old wounds shape the paths you took without your noticing them. He also thought about Hannah Delaney. He was fairly certain this was not entirely reasonable of him, given their extremely brief acquaintance. He thought about it anyway. He rode into town on Tuesday morning and went to the feed merchant first, where he found Bill Tanner exactly as his uncle had predicted, and engaged him to start work at the end of the week. Then he went to the land office and spent 2 hours going over the property records and outstanding debt with a thorough and competent man named George Abbott, who seemed to take genuine satisfaction in the untangling of complicated paper situations. By noon, he had a clear picture of what the property owed and to whom and in what order of priority, which was considerably more useful than the vague dread he had been carrying for the past 2 weeks. He came out of the land office into the noon heat of Main Street and saw Hannah Delaney crossing at the far end of the block with a basket of what appeared to be clean, folded laundry balanced on one arm. She had not seen him. He watched her turn the corner without breaking stride and disappear, and he stood on the boardwalk for a moment with an unfamiliar feeling in his chest that he spent a moment identifying as the desire to follow her. He did not follow her. That would have been peculiar behavior. Instead, he went to the hotel dining room for lunch and ate a reasonable meal, and told himself he was behaving sensibly. On Wednesday, he was in the feed merchant's again picking up a supply order when he heard the bell above the door and looked up, and it was Hannah. She was wearing the same mended dress and carrying a list written in the clear handwriting of someone who had been taught by a teacher, and she stopped when she saw him with an expression that was not quite surprise. "Mr. Merritt," she said. "Cade," he said. A pause. "Cade." She said his name carefully, as if testing whether it fit correctly. "Are you settling your uncle's affairs, then? Working on it?" He moved aside to give her access to the merchant's counter. "It is more complicated than I anticipated. Most things are." She gave her list to the merchant's boy and then looked back at Cade with that direct, steady gaze. "Is your uncle seriously ill?" "Yes." "I am sorry." And she meant it, he could tell, not in the automatic social way but in the genuine human way of someone who had known loss themselves and recognized the texture of it in others. "Were you born here?" he asked. "In Abilene?" "No, Caldwell." She accepted the wrapped parcels from the boy and put them in her basket. "I came 4 years ago, and you stayed. It is as good a place as any." She said it without self-pity, as pure statement of fact. "What about you?" "I grew up near here, left in '66, and you came back." "I had a reason to." She looked at him for a moment, and there was something careful in her expression, something that was measuring him against a scale she had developed through experience and was not yet ready to share. "Well," she said, "I hope the affairs resolve themselves properly." "Thank you." He held the door for her as she moved to leave. "Miss Delaney," she looked back, "the market is on Saturday again." Something moved across her face, something he could not entirely read. "It is every Saturday," she said. And then she was gone into the Wednesday heat, and he stood in the feed merchant's doorway for a moment listening to the dry sound of the town going about its business. Saturday came with the slow certainty of all Saturdays, and Cade Merritt was at the market an hour before noon. He told himself he was there for hardware supplies, which was partially true. He found the hardware stall and made his purchases, and then stood with them under his arm for a while, watching the market move around him. And then Hannah appeared between the vegetable stalls at the south end of the street, and his chest did that thing again that was inconvenient and impossible to ignore. She saw him almost immediately. He thought she had been looking, though neither of them would have admitted that. She came toward him with the kind of walk that was not hurried but had a destination, and when she reached him, there was a color in her cheeks that might have been the heat and might have been something else. "You are here," she said. "I told you I was in town for the foreseeable future." "So you did." She looked at his hardware parcel, shopping, among other things. He looked at her basket, which held a paper-wrapped purchase from the food merchant and a small bundle of dried flowers from the flower stall at the corner. "Is the calico working out?" She blinked, surprised that he had remembered. "Beautifully. Mrs. Patterson is very pleased with the curtains. Good." He fell into step beside her without quite planning to, and she allowed it without quite inviting him, and they walked through the market together in the way of two people who have wordlessly arrived at the same arrangement. "Tell me about your uncle's property," she said. "You said it was complicated." He told her. He was not a man who talked easily about his troubles generally, but there was something about the way she listened, attentive and steady, asking the right questions at the right moments, that made the situation simpler and easier to lay out clearly. He told her about the debts and the state of the south fence and the need for reliable hired hands, and she listened to all of it and then said, "George Abbott at the land office is the person to speak to about the debt timeline. I have already spoken to him. He was very helpful." She nodded. "He was helpful to me once as well when I was sorting out some papers that Thomas left behind." She said the name without evident pain, just factually, the way you might mention the weather last Tuesday. "Thomas?" He asked it carefully, not wanting to push. "My former fiancé." She glanced at him sideways as if checking his reaction. "He left for Denver 4 years ago, left me with his bills and rather too much of his business to sort out." A pause. "He is someone I try not to waste time thinking about." Cade absorbed this. "Good policy. I have found so." She stopped at a stall that was selling small glass bottles of rosewater and picked one up, examining it. "Were you ever in that direction yourself?" He hesitated. "Once. A long time ago." She waited. "It did not proceed as I expected." He looked down at the hardware parcel in his hands. It was instructive. Hannah set the rosewater bottle down and looked at him directly. "Did it make you cautious?" "Very." "Me too," she said. They stood in the middle of the Saturday market looking at each other, and the people flowed around them and the merchants called their prices, and it felt for a moment as if the whole ordinary noise of the world had become a frame around something that was happening in the center of it, quiet and important, and not entirely safe. "There is a good eating house 2 streets over," he said. "The food is honest and the coffee is better than the hotel. If you have not eaten, and if you are willing to be seen dining with someone the town does not entirely know yet." She considered this for a full 10 seconds, which he respected enormously. "The town talks," she said. "It does. People will have opinions. They will. Mabel Crow will have several opinions, all of them loudly held. I imagine so." Another pause. He waited. "I have not eaten," Hannah said, "and I like honest food." The eating house was called Harrigan's, and it was run by a red-faced Irishman named Patrick Harrigan who had come west in 1865, and apparently decided that what the Kansas plains needed most was a decent plate of food served without ceremony. The room held 6 tables, and 3 of them were occupied when Cade and Hannah came in, and the 3 occupied tables looked at them with the frank curiosity of a small town that knows most of its own business and is very interested in anything new. They sat by the window, and Cade ordered coffee and stew for both of them, and Hannah told him about Caldwell, and about her father who had been a school teacher, and her mother who had been the more practically capable of the two in the way that many school teachers' wives needed to be. She told him about growing up with books in every room of the house, and how that had given her a habit of thinking carefully about things, which had not always made her popular but had generally made her right. "Your father taught you to read well?" he asked. "He taught me to read everything. The newspaper and the Bible and the town records and the back of a medicine bottle and the expression on a horse's face. He said reading was not a skill for one particular kind of text. It was a way of paying attention." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I miss him constantly." "I can hear it," Cade said. She looked at him. "Tell me something about yourself, something that is not about cattle or land records." He thought about it. "I read too, mostly history. I carry a book when I travel." He paused, slightly self-conscious about this. "It is not common in my line of work." "Does it bother you that it is not common?" "It used to. It doesn't anymore." She nodded slowly as if this confirmed something. "What history?" "American, mostly. The Revolution. I am interested in how things begin. What the first decisions look like before anyone knows how consequential they are." He stopped, not certain why he was saying this much. "It is a peculiar interest for a cattle drover." "It is an interesting interest for a person," she said, and meant it, and the warmth in her voice when she said it did something to his chest that was becoming familiar and was no longer unwelcome. They stayed at Harrigan's for 2 hours. They talked about Kansas and Texas, and the changes in Abilene since the cattle trade had transformed it, and whether those changes were improvements or simply enlargements, which was not the same thing. They talked about what it felt like to be a person who had come from somewhere else, and was still working out whether the somewhere they had arrived at was home. They talked about small, careful things and large, general things, and all of it was easy in the way that things are easy when 2 people are genuinely interested in each other's minds. Cade walked her back to Mrs. Patterson's house afterward, carrying her market basket, because it was on his way back to the hotel, which was a marginal claim at best, but she did not challenge it. At the gate of Mrs. Patterson's small yard, she took the basket back, and they stood in the late afternoon light, and he said, "Would you come out to the property some time, if you had a day free? There is a view of the land from the East Hill that I think you would appreciate." She was quiet for a moment. "That is quite an invitation." "I know." He did not pretend otherwise. She looked at him steadily. "I will think about it. That is all I am asking." She went through the gate, and he walked back through the late afternoon streets of Abilene, and he was aware, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 7 years being very careful about what he allows himself to want, that something had changed. Something had been set in motion that would not be easy to stop. He was not entirely certain he wanted to stop it. The following Tuesday, Mabel Crow appeared at Mrs. Patterson's door. Hannah was in the backyard hanging laundry when Mrs. Patterson came out with her near-sighted expression of mild alarm to report the visitor. Hannah dried her hands on her apron and went to the front door and found Mabel standing on the porch with the expression of a woman who has prepared a speech. "I want to talk to you about that man," Mabel said. "Which man would that be?" Hannah asked. With a politeness she had spent 4 years perfecting, Mabel's eyes narrowed. "The one who made a fool of himself in the market last Saturday. The one who called you his guest in front of the whole town when everyone knows you are no such thing." "I was not aware that being a stranger's guest required prior arrangement," Hannah said. "But I appreciate your interest in the matter. Do not be clever with me, Hannah Delaney. That man is Robert Merritt's nephew, and he has been gone from this town for 7 years, and he came back for one reason, which is the property. And once that property is settled, he will be gone again. I am trying to help you." Hannah looked at Mabel Crow and thought about several things. She thought about the calico and the laughter, and the 2 hours at Harrigan's, and the way Cade Merritt had said, "That is all I am asking," in a voice that was entirely without pressure or performance. And she thought about Thomas Wyatt's letters, which had been full of promise and entirely empty of substance. "Thank you for your concern," she said pleasantly. "Is there anything else?" Mabel gave her a long look that was composed in roughly equal parts of dislike, and something that might, in a different person, have been actual worry. Then she turned and walked back down the path, and Hannah closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The thing was, Mabel was not entirely wrong. Cade had said himself that he was here to settle his uncle's affairs. He had not said he was staying permanently. And Hannah had rebuilt her life in Abilene on very careful foundations after Thomas had knocked the first version of it flat, and she had not done that in order to let it be knocked flat a second time. She went back to the laundry. She thought about it all afternoon. That evening she went to Mrs. Patterson's sitting room with her mending, and Mrs. Patterson read aloud from a novel she had borrowed from the lending library, which she did most evenings. And about halfway through a chapter, Hannah said, "You think people change fundamentally from who they were when they were young, Mrs. Patterson looked up over her reading spectacles. "I think they change around the edges," she said, "but the center stays much the same." "Why?" "Idle thought," said Hannah. Mrs. Patterson looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were nearsighted but not unobservant. "Is this about the young man from the market? The whole town is talking, I suppose." "The whole town has been talking since Saturday noon," said Mrs. Patterson with some satisfaction. "He is Robert Merritt's nephew, you know. I knew Robert slightly. He was a good man, quiet." She paused. "The boy, or the man I suppose he is now, left under something of a cloud. No one was quite clear on the specifics." "What kind of cloud?" "The young kind. Hurt pride. A girl who chose differently." Mrs. Patterson closed her book over one finger to hold the place. "I do not think it was anything dishonorable. I think it was simply very painful at 20, and he did not know how to stay somewhere that reminded him of it." Hannah sewed a small, careful stitch. "And now he has come back." "And now he has come back," Mrs. Patterson agreed and opened her book again. "I think that says something." On Thursday, a boy from the hotel arrived at Mrs. Patterson's house with a note. It was written in a hand that was clear and direct and surprisingly legible for a cattle drover on hotel paper, and it said, "I am going out to the property tomorrow morning. If you have any interest in seeing the land, I will be at the East Road at 8 o'clock. If not, I understand entirely. Either way, I hope you are well. K. Merritt." She read it 3 times. Then she wrote a very brief reply on the back of the paper because she only had one piece and it seemed practical, and sent it back with the boy. It said, "I will be there at 8, H. Delaney." She was there at 5 minutes to 8 because she was a person who considered punctuality a form of honesty. He was there at exactly 8, on horseback, with a second horse saddled and waiting that made her stop and stare for a moment, because that required forethought of a specific kind. "I took the liberty," he said, with something in his expression that was slightly uncertain in a way she found appealing. "You did," she said. "Can you ride?" "My father had a horse." She approached the mare, a quiet bay with intelligent eyes, and checked the girth the way her father had taught her, because you always check the girth, and Cade watched her do it with an expression she could not entirely interpret. They rode out the east road in the early morning cool, before the August heat had gathered itself into its full oppressive weight, and he told her about the land as they rode through it, not in the enthusiastic way of a salesman or the indifferent way of a man reciting facts, but in the careful, observant way of someone who had grown up on this prairie and carried its geography inside him, and was offering her access to something that was genuinely his. The property was rougher than she had expected. The house was a solid structure that needed paint and repairs to the front porch, but the bones of it were good. The barn was in better condition than the house. The pasture land was dry but not exhausted. She could see what it had been and what it needed to become, and she said so. He looked at her with a kind of surprised appreciation, as if he had expected something polite and received something useful instead. "I am going to spend the next 3 months here," he said. "There is enough money to fix it and restock and make a proper go of it, if I am careful about the order of expenditure." "Is that what you want, to stay?" They had ridden to the east hill he had mentioned, and the view from it was exactly what he had promised. The Kansas prairie rolled away in every direction under a sky so large it seemed like its own separate world, pale blue shading to white at the horizon, and the morning light lay across the grass in long, warm lines. She understood why he had wanted her to see it. "Yes," he said, looking out at the land. "I did not know that when I came. I thought I was coming to settle Robert's affairs and then decide. But I have been here 3 weeks and I know the answer." He paused. "I want to stay." She turned to look at him, this man she had known for 11 days, and thought about the nature of wanting things that felt true and might also be dangerous. "What about the life you had in Texas?" "It was a good life, a working life." He met her eyes, "but it was not home." She rode back to Abilene with him in the late morning, and he showed her the south fence that needed repair and the spring that had partially silted up, and the stand of cottonwood trees along the creek that were the only shade for half a mile. And she asked questions about all of it, and he answered them. And by the time they reached the point where the east road met the main Abilene road, it felt as if they had known each other for a much longer time than 11 days. "I have to go to the hotel and meet Bill Tanner," he said, drawing his horse up. "But I am glad you came." "So am I," she said. And then, because she was a person who had decided to pay careful attention to herself, "I was worried about coming. I thought it was probably unwise. And now—" She thought about the prairie rolling away under the big sky and the careful lists he kept, and the way he had looked at the land with something that was very close to love. "And now I am less worried," she said, "but I am still paying attention." "That is all I would ask," he said, for the second time. And she thought, riding back toward town, that this might be the most reassuring thing anyone had said to her in 4 years. Robert Merritt died in the second week of September. Cade had been staying at the hotel and riding out to the property daily, and he had been sitting with Robert in the evenings as regularly as his schedule permitted. Robert died on a Monday evening quietly, while Cade was reading to him from an old Kansas history that they had found in a box of Robert's books. One moment he was there, and then he simply was not, and the room was very still, and Cade sat with the open book in his hands for several minutes before he set it down. He had expected grief, because he had known it was coming. What surprised him was the specific quality of it, The way it was tangled up with the satisfaction of having come back in time, of having been present, which was something he had not given himself in other losses, and which mattered more than he had expected. He made the arrangements that needed making. He rode into town the next morning and stopped at Mrs. Patterson's house, because he had told her 2 days ago that Robert was near the end, and she had said, very simply, to come and tell her when it happened. She answered the door before he could knock, as if she had been listening for the sound of his horse. She looked at his face and said, "I am sorry." Not the elaborate social form of it, but the plain, honest version, and he stood on her porch in the September morning and felt the grief settle into a shape he could carry. "Come in," she said. "I will make coffee." He sat at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table, and Hannah made coffee while Mrs. Patterson was somewhere in the back of the house, with the tactful instincts of a woman who understood exactly when her presence was and was not required. And Cade sat in the kitchen and talked about Robert. He talked about the history book they had been reading. He talked about Robert's opinions on fence repair and the proper ratio of horses to cattle for a property this size. He talked about the conversations they had had in the evenings, the lucid ones and the wandering ones, and Hannah listened to all of it with the attention she gave to everything. The quality of attention that made you feel you were being heard rather than waited out. "He was glad you came," she said. "Whatever else, he knew you were there, that mattered." "Yes." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I am glad I came too, even knowing how much work there is now. Are you still going to stay?" He looked at her directly. "I have told you I am." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know you have." Something passed between them in the kitchen that was not quite said and not quite unsaid, and then Mrs. Patterson reappeared with the perfect timing of someone who had been listening at the hallway door, which was exactly what she had been doing, and asked if anyone wanted something to eat. The autumn came to Kansas like it always did, with a sudden shift in the light that made everything look both more beautiful and more fragile. The grass went gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned a color that had no good name in English. Cade worked the property 7 days a week with Bill Tanner, and a second man he had hired named Jim Cross, repairing the fence and clearing the silted spring, and beginning to rebuild the herd with 20 head of good cattle purchased from a reliable seller that George Abbott at the land office recommended. He and Hannah saw each other twice a week with a regularity that had developed without being formally arranged. Saturday markets, always. And one day during the week that shifted depending on his work and her laundry schedule. Sometimes a walk along the main street, sometimes coffee at Harrigan's, once a picnic that Hannah organized with cheese and bread and apple preserves from Mrs. Patterson's store, eaten at the base of the East Hill on his property in the warm, gold October light. They talked about everything. They disagreed about several things, which Cade found not just acceptable but actually enjoyable in a way he had not expected. And Hannah found similarly, because she had not in her adult life had many conversations where she was expected to hold a position and defend it rather than simply agree. They were both reading a book about the geography of the American frontier that Hannah had borrowed from the lending library and then lent to him, and they had strong and divergent opinions about several of its conclusions, which provided material for at least 4 excellent arguments. What they had not done was speak directly about what was building between them. They both knew it was there. It was there in the way he made sure to be at the market before she arrived, and in the way she had started walking the slightly longer route that took her past the hotel when she was delivering laundry on the east side of town, in case he happened to be coming or going. It was there in the way they finished each other's points in conversation, and in the way they sat close enough at Harrigan's that there was something almost domestic about it. But they were both, for their own reasons, careful people. And being careful meant that the thing between them grew slowly and solidly, like a structure being built by someone who intends it to last. It was Mabel Crow who, entirely against her intentions, precipitated the next development. Mabel had been quiet since the market confrontation in August, relatively speaking, which meant she had limited her unpleasantness to pointed comments made to third parties rather than direct attacks. But in October she appeared again, this time at Harrigan's eating house on a Wednesday afternoon when Hannah and Cade were having coffee. She came in with two of her usual companions and was seated at the table directly across the room, and she spent the better part of an hour conducting a conversation at a volume, pitched perfectly for carrying across a room, full of references to women who did not know their place and men who would eventually come to their senses, and the general inadvisability of certain people making certain assumptions. Hannah sat very still and drank her coffee and said nothing. Cade drank his coffee and also said nothing, but the line of his jaw had changed in a way that Hannah recognized now as the external sign of something being contained with effort. After a few minutes, he set his cup down and leaned forward slightly and said quietly only to her, "You do not have to sit here and endure this." "I have been enduring Mabel Crow for 4 years," Hannah said. "I know how." "That does not mean you should have to." She looked at him. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that she recognized as genuine anger, not the hot variety but the colder and more considered kind that was in some ways more impressive. "What would you do?" she asked. "If I were not asking you to do nothing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would go over there and ask Mabel Crow very politely whether she would be willing to explain what specific harm you have ever done her, and I would ask it loudly enough that the entire room could hear the answer." Hannah considered this. That would cause a great deal of talk. It would. He held her gaze. Is that a reason not to do it? She thought about Thomas Wyatt, who had been very careful about what people thought of him and had maintained that carefulness right up to the moment he put a note on the kitchen table and disappeared. She thought about 4 years of Mabel Crow's small cruelties, absorbed in silence because making a scene seemed worse than the alternative. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." Something shifted in his face. He stood up, and she thought for a moment that he was actually going to do it, walk across the room to Mabel Crow and ask his polite, devastating question, but instead he held out his hand. "Then let us leave," he said. "Not because she has driven us out, but because the afternoon is better spent somewhere else." She took his hand. He helped her up from her chair, and she tucked her hand through his arm, and they walked out of Harrigan's together, and she felt the eyes of the room on them as they went, and she found that she did not mind at all. On the street, in the October afternoon, she kept her hand on his arm and they walked without any particular destination, and after a moment he said, "Hannah." "Yes. I want to say something and I want to say it plainly, because I am not a man who is good at indirection." Her heart did something she was powerless to prevent. "All right." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and he was looking at her with the same quality of attention he gave to his land and his work and his uncle's story. That complete and focused regard that she had come to understand was the most essential thing about him. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been, I think, since you told me I was being incredibly presumptuous and were grateful anyway. I am not in any hurry and I have no expectations. But I wanted you to know, because keeping it to myself seemed like a kind of dishonesty, and I will not be dishonest with you." She looked at him standing in the October street with his hat in his hands, because he had taken it off without apparently noticing, and the light was coming sideways and gold through the town, and his face was entirely open, and entirely serious, and entirely, without any of the performance or calculation that she had spent 4 years learning to watch for. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been trying very hard not to be because I am a cautious person and you gave me very little warning." Something broke open in his expression. "I did not have warning myself," he said. "You should know that. I believe you." She put her hand back on his arm, more firmly than before. "And I want you to know something in return. I'm not afraid of staying in Abilene when things are difficult. I have been doing it for 4 years. What I am afraid of is investing in something that will leave." He covered her hand with his. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I came back here to stay. The land is mine and the work is mine, and this is where I mean to build something that lasts." A pause. "I hope you might want to be part of that, eventually. There is no urgency." She squeezed his hand. "There is some urgency," she said. "I am 24 and I have been patient long enough." He laughed, a real laugh that she had not heard from him before, warm and full, and it changed his whole face into something that made her feel she had discovered a room in a house she thought she knew. "Is that a yes?" "That is a strong inclination toward yes," she said. "Give me a little more time, not long." "Whatever you need," he said. He gave her 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks the autumn deepened, and the work on the property progressed, and Cade hired a third man, and the herd grew, and the south fence was repaired, and the spring was fully cleared. Hannah finished her laundry contracts for the week and started teaching Mrs. Patterson's neighbor's daughter to read better. Because the girl's schooling had gaps and Hannah's father's habit of believing that reading was the most important skill you could give a person had become her own conviction. They took another ride out to the property on a clear November morning, and he showed her the house, which he had repaired and repainted, and in which he had replaced 2 windows and the kitchen floor. And she walked through it room by room with the attention she gave to everything. And when she came to the kitchen, she stood in the November light that came through the new window and thought about what it would look like with her mother's good china on the shelf. She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her, with the same expression he had worn on the East Road the first morning she had ridden out, that particular combination of uncertainty and hope that she had decided was the most trustworthy expression she had ever seen on a man's face. "Yes," she said. He was across the kitchen in 3 steps, and she was in his arms, and he held her with a steadiness that she thought was the physical version of everything he was, solid and careful and not going anywhere. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt something that had been held very tightly in her chest for 4 years, maybe for her whole life, release itself into the November air of the farmhouse kitchen. "I was hoping you were going to say that," he said quietly above her head. "I know you were." She pulled back enough to look up at him. "We are going to have to tell Mabel Crow." He looked at her seriously. "Mabel Crow can work that out for herself." She laughed, and he smiled down at her, and the kitchen was warm with the November sun, and outside the prairie rolled away in all directions under a sky that had no end. They were married in the Abilene church on a Thursday in December of 1873, which was a cold, clear day with a sky so blue it looked painted. Mrs. Patterson cried in the front pew with the wholehearted satisfaction of a woman who had seen the whole thing developing and felt a proprietary interest in the outcome. Bill Tanner and Jim Cross came in from the property and cleaned up sufficiently for a church. George Abbott from the land office attended because he had a soft spot for tidy resolution of any kind. Hannah's friend Inez from the hotel laundry stood with her as witness, and Cade had a friend from his Texas years, a tall, quiet man named Sam Howell, who had ridden 3 days to be there. Mabel Crow was not present. The minister performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and occasional evident warmth. And when Cade put the ring on Hannah's finger, she looked up at him and thought about the market in August, about laughter and calico, and a man who had spoken up without knowing why. And she thought that the distance between that moment and this one was the exact distance between being alone and not being alone, and that she would never be able to measure it because it was too large. They said their vows clearly and meant every word. The reception was at Harrigan's, because Patrick Harrigan charged them a fair price and provided excellent food and was the kind of man who understood that a wedding was an occasion requiring a certain quality of effort. Hannah wore a dress she had made herself from ivory muslin with small embroidered flowers at the collar, and Cade had bought himself a new coat and looked extremely well in it, a fact he was entirely unconscious of, which made it better. Mrs. Patterson gave a short speech that was funny and warm and ended with her crying again, which got most of the room as well. Sam Howell made a speech that was 3 sentences long and entirely sincere. Bill Tanner declined to make a speech, but raised his glass with an expression that conveyed everything adequately. Hannah danced with Cade for a long time because the fiddler Harrigan had hired was very good, and because dancing with Cade was nothing like she had expected, which was that he would be stiff and self-conscious. He was neither of those things. He was attentive and steady and moved with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. And she thought that she was very glad to know this about him, and would be glad to go on knowing new things about him for a very long time. They went out to the property that evening, which was now her property as much as his, and the cold night air smelled of frost and dry grass, and the lamp they had left burning in the kitchen window was the most welcoming thing she had ever seen in her life. The first year of their marriage was one of the most demanding and rewarding years either of them had ever known. The cattle operation grew steadily, with Cade's careful management and genuine skill, and by the spring of 1874 the property was profitable, not extravagantly so, but solidly and consistently, which in Cade's view was considerably more valuable. Hannah continued her laundry work for most of the first year, partly because the income was useful and partly because she was a practical woman who did not abandon things until she had built the replacement. But by that autumn, the ranch was doing well enough that she could stop, and she stopped. What she replaced it with was something she had not entirely planned, but which turned out to be the right thing. She had been teaching Mrs. Patterson's neighbor's girl through the winter and spring, and by summer she had 4 children whose parents paid her a small fee to teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic 3 mornings a week at the farmhouse kitchen table. By the following year she had 8 children. The year after that, she was teaching in a proper schoolroom that Cade built onto the side of the house with timber from the cottonwood stand along the creek, which she had told him 3 separate times he absolutely should not cut, until she realized he was cutting the ones that were already dead and taking care to leave the living trees, and then she felt slightly unreasonable about her objections. The school became something the county needed and did not yet have officially, and by 1876, Hannah had applied to the county board for recognition as a proper school and been granted it, and became a teacher by credential as well as by practice, which would have made her father, she thought, very happy. In the spring of 1875, their son was born. They named him Robert because it was right, and because Cade had wanted to honor his uncle's memory in some form that would last longer than a headstone. Robert Merritt arrived on an April morning when the prairie was just beginning to turn green again after the winter, and he came into the world with a directness and apparent determination that the doctor said was unusual in an infant, and that both his parents recognized as entirely characteristic. He had Hannah's brown eyes and Cade's dark hair, and the loud certainty of someone who intended to be heard. Cade sat in the kitchen chair holding him the first evening with an expression that Hannah had never seen on his face before, open and stunned, and absolutely without any of the careful reserve he carried in the world. And she sat across the kitchen table from him, and thought that this was the room she had pictured when she stood in the November light before she said yes, and that it was better than she had pictured because nothing real is ever quite what you imagine, but sometimes it is better. "Hello, Robert," Cade said very quietly to the baby in his arms. "You have a great deal of land to learn about." "He is 4 hours old," Hannah said. "The sooner he starts, the better." But he looked up from the baby to her with eyes that said something he did not put into words, which was that he was aware of the distance they had traveled from a market on a Saturday in August to this kitchen in April, and that it seemed to him miraculous, and that he intended to spend a very long time being grateful for it. Mabel Crow, for what it was worth, had gone through a change of some kind. Her husband Francis had gotten ill himself in the winter of 1874, nothing fatal but serious enough to occasion a general reckoning, and Mabel had apparently spent his recovery thinking about how she occupied herself and what it produced. She had not apologized to Hannah, and Hannah did not expect her to. But she had stopped her public unpleasantness, and in the spring of 1875, when news spread through town about the baby, she had sent a practical and not unkind gift of a wool blanket with a card that said congratulations and nothing else, which was more than Hannah had expected, and which she acknowledged with a proper written note of thanks. "That is the end of something," Mrs. Patterson said, when Hannah told her about the blanket. "I think so," Hannah agreed. "I am glad to be done with it." Life on the Merritt property in the years that followed had the quality of something that had been built correctly from the foundation up. There were difficulties, because the West in the 1870s was always full of them. A drought in 1876 that cost them 8 head of cattle, and a hard season of careful budgeting. A dispute with a neighboring landowner over a shared water source that took 6 months to resolve through legal means, and cost more in lawyers' fees than either party had anticipated. There was the winter of 1877, when little Robert had a fever that frightened both his parents badly for 4 days before breaking, and the doctor rode out from town in the cold and sat with them through the worst of it. And Hannah and Cade did not sleep properly for those 4 days, and held each other in the kitchen in the deep hours of the night without speaking. Robert recovered completely and was running across the kitchen floor the following week, and climbing the fence posts he had been repeatedly told not to climb by the week after that. Their daughter was born in 1877, in the September, and they named her Josephine after Hannah's mother, whose given name had been Josephine Marie Delaney. Josephine arrived with her mother's directness, and her father's dark eyes, and an immediate and vociferous opinion about the world that she expressed at considerable volume. Robert, who was 2½ by then, examined his sister with the solemn interest of a small scientist and then looked at his parents and said, "She is loud." "She is," Cade agreed. "So were you." Robert considered this and seemed to find it reasonable. By 1878, the school had 12 children enrolled, and Hannah was formally employed by the county school board, which meant a salary and a recognition that the work she was doing was not charitable but professional. She taught 5 days a week in the mornings, and managed the house in the afternoons, and was deeply, genuinely fulfilled in a way she had never expected to say about either of those things, and was surprised by every day. She had thought she would be a laundress, and she had become a teacher and a rancher's wife and a mother, and none of those things was what she had thought her life would look like when she was 19 in Caldwell with her father's books and her mother's practicality, but all of them were hers. Cade ran the property with the same care and competence he brought to everything, expanding slowly and carefully, never overextending, building the kind of operation that could sustain bad years, because the good years had been managed with foresight. He had a reputation in the county now, the kind that comes not from flashiness but from reliability, and men who needed advice about cattle or land came to him with a regularity that occasionally overwhelmed his preference for quiet. He was not a particularly social man. He was very social with Hannah and with his children and with the small circle of people, Mrs. Patterson and Bill Tanner and Sam Howell on his visits, and George Abbott and Inez and her husband, who had become the irreducible core of their life together. On Saturday evenings, when the children were in bed and the work of the day was done, he and Hannah sat on the porch of the farmhouse that had once been Robert's and was now theirs, and they talked. They talked about the school and the cattle and the children and the books they were reading still, always, both of them readers to their bones, and they talked about large things and small things and things with no practical application whatsoever. And sometimes they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who have been sufficiently honest with each other. That silence is not a distance, but a closeness. In 1879, on an evening in late August that was 6 years almost to the week from the Saturday in the Abilene market, Hannah sat on the porch with Cade watching the late summer light go gold across the prairie, and she said, without particular preface, "Do you ever think about the market?" That first Saturday, he was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. What do you think about?" "I think about how close I came to not stopping." He turned to look at her. "I was on my way to the hardware merchant. I had a list. I was going to be in and out of town by noon." "Why did you stop?" He considered it, as he always considered things that deserved consideration rather than quick answers. "I do not have a complete answer," he said. Something about the way everyone was looking away. Something about the difference between what was happening and what should have been happening instead. A pause. "And something about you specifically, something that I could not have named at the time and could not have justified." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Mrs. Patterson says the center of a person stays the same even when the edges change. That sounds like her. She is usually right." Hannah watched a nighthawk cut across the darkening sky. "I think the part of you that stopped was always there. You have been that person your entire life." He put his arm around her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "I am glad I stopped. So am I." She turned her face up to look at him in the last of the light. This man who had walked toward her through a crowd of people who were all looking away, who had been presumptuous and known it and done it anyway, who had given her the calico and his name and eventually everything else. Cade. "Hannah." She put her hand on his face. He covered it with his. The prairie dark was gathering at the edges of the world, and the lamp was burning in the kitchen window, and somewhere inside the house their children were asleep. Robert sprawled on his bed with one arm hanging off. Josephine curled small and certain of herself, as she always was in everything. "I want another one," she said. "Another child, if you want that too." He was quiet for the space of a breath. Then he turned his head and pressed his mouth against her palm, warm and deliberate. "I want whatever you want," he said. "I have thought that for a very long time." She laughed, soft and real, and he smiled. And the night settled over the Kansas prairie around them, and the lamp burned in the window, and nothing that needed to be said was left unsaid. Their second son was born in the summer of 1880. They named him James, because it was a name they both liked for its plainness and honesty, and he arrived with his father's quiet energy and his mother's brown eyes and a calm that was different from either of his siblings' temperaments and all his own. Robert, who was 5 by then, received him with fraternal gravity. Josephine, who was 3, attempted to carry him across the kitchen floor before anyone could stop her, which was absolutely characteristic of Josephine. The summer of 1880 was a good one. The drought of 1876 was long past, and the cattle were healthy and the school was thriving, and the people who mattered to them were well. Mrs. Patterson had grown frail in the previous year, as she was nearly 70, and the Kansas winters were not lenient. But she was sharp and warm and came out to the farm for Sunday dinners with the regularity of a fixed point in the calendar. And Hannah drove into Abilene and sat with her twice a week, and this arrangement suited everyone. On a late summer evening with James 3 weeks old and sleeping in his cradle and Robert and Josephine both improbably asleep at the same time, Hannah and Cade sat in the kitchen with coffee, and the lamp burning low, the way they sat in the evenings when the day's work was done, and there was time to be simply present with each other. "Do you remember what you said?" Cade asked. "On the first day at the market." "I said several things. You said it was incredibly presumptuous." He looked at her over his coffee cup with the warmth that had become, in 6 years, as natural to him as breathing, not less itself for being constant but more. "And that you were very grateful." Both things were true. They were. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I have thought many times about what would have happened if I had walked past, if I had been 2 minutes earlier and already in the hardware store." "You were not," she said. "I was not." He laced his fingers through hers. "I think sometimes there are things that are simply going to happen. Regardless of the timing and the hardware store and the list I had." She looked at him steadily. "That is unusually philosophical for a cattle rancher. I have been influenced by a schoolteacher." She smiled and he smiled, and the lamp burned between them, and the baby slept in his cradle. And outside the window the summer night held the prairie in its warm, dark hands, and the story that had begun with laughter in a market on a Saturday morning had become something that had no end point, only continuation. Only the ongoing and ordinary and entirely remarkable fact of 2 people who had found each other in the middle of everything else, and decided to stay. Hannah Delaney had come to Abilene with nothing, and had built a life that was completely and entirely hers. Cade Merritt had left Abilene with nothing, and had come back and built a life that was now theirs together. And in the end, which was not an end at all, they sat in the kitchen of the house on the Kansas prairie with the children sleeping and the coffee warm and the lamp burning in the window that could be seen from the east road for a 1/4 of a mile. A small, steady light against the dark, and between them was the whole of what they had made together, which was a great deal and was exactly enough and was, in every possible sense, home.